Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. We will continue the topic of food in this session. So thank you all for being here. As introduced, I'm Andrew Brentano, CEO, co-founder of Tiny Farms, Inc., based in California in the United States. I want to thank you all for being here, being part of this session, and I'm going to try to keep my talk a little bit on the shorter side because I'd love to get to questions as well. This is a very big topic. I'm going to breeze through a lot of kind of information, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. So I'll give you a little more background on myself. I've been studying and working in the food system since 2012, when we first conceived of and started building our company, Tiny Farms, Inc. Before coming into food, as mentioned, I worked in the technology space where I worked on commercializing AI, artificial intelligence systems. That was an interesting thing. The thing about working in artificial intelligence and in tech is that we're always striving for maximum efficiency. We're always trying to optimize solutions. And the way we do that was with lots of data. And so, one of the themes running through this summit is data and software and, digitization of different sectors of the economy. So I came from a very, purely digital background and shifted into food. We started thinking about food and looking at the food system and learning how food was being produced and thinking about how food was going to be produced in the future, brought that mindset with us of, look at the data and understand how things are going, understand the dependencies in the system. And so when we looked at the food system in this way, really trying to look at the flow of resources through it, where the bottlenecks were, where the inefficiencies were, it was kind of shocking. We realized, that the food system was kind of in trouble, and I'll get to more of that later. But we decided that we had an opportunity to come in and try to change things to really improve the production efficiencies, and we focused on protein. Animal protein in particular is the most resource-intensive piece of food production, and we realized, there are alternatives. In our case, we decided to focus on insect protein, which I'll get to, where we can drastically reduce the amount of land, nutrient inputs, water, and greenhouse gas emissions required for animal protein consumption. So that's my background. We've now spent the last 6 years working on producing insects, developing technology for both growing large numbers of insects and processing them into a commodity protein. And now I'll get into the topic itself. So there we go. So what is the future of food? This isn't a question that I've been asked to talk to you about. Well, this is a cool thing. This is a robot that makes a cheeseburger that is about to go live in San Francisco. It's completely automated. So if you ask kind of the news headlines and the venture capitalists, particularly based in Silicon Valley, they would say that, the future of food is going to be robot chefs. They're going to be serving out salads and vegetables that were grown in indoor farms. You'll have a side of lab-grown meat. You're going to have some plant-based burgers. You're going to have some crunchy crickets. Your fields are going to be completely automated. There's going to be drones and robotic combines that are planting your seeds and harvesting. And it's a very optimistic view that we get. The thing is, as many of you probably know, the situation is a little more dire than that. We're facing a massive population growth and a lot of challenges. If we're thinking about producing protein for the next, food, particularly protein, for the next 20, 30, 50 years, we're going to have to change the way things are going. The amount of resources that we have available are not sufficient to supply the amount of food that we need to create. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to first dive into a lot of the big challenges that we're facing going forward. I'm actually going to spend a bit of time on this because even though I'm sure many of you are aware of a lot of these issues, the entire mental framework that we need to construct when we're thinking about making strategic decisions going forward needs to be considered in the context of these massive challenges. After that, I'm going to overview some of the very exciting and cool solutions, very high impact solutions that are available to us. So we're heading for a big world population. Estimates by 2050 say that we're going to hit a global population of about 9 billion people. The United Nations believes that we'll have to produce 70% more food using fewer resources than we're currently using to produce the amount of food we're growing now. That's a pretty tall order, so that's setting the stage. The other aspect of this trend that's particularly troubling when we're thinking about how we're going to pull this off is that per capita consumption of the highly resource-intensive foods like meat is also growing. The sort of underlying trend behind that is good news, that there's rising incomes in many countries around the world, and as people join the middle class, one of the first things they spend more money on is more meat. Meat is good. It's good for us for the most part. But, you know, we've got a situation where already we have hundreds of millions of people facing food insecurity. So how are we going to go forward? How are we going to produce enough food for everyone? We're going to have to produce all this extra food, but we're going to have to do it, like I said, with many fewer resources. It's hard to emphasize the amount of water, labor, and land usage that's required to produce our current system. I'm going to run through these challenges, the major issues that are facing food production: land, water, climate change, and labor. So currently there are, and since 1992, there's been about 49 million square kilometers of land being farmed around the world. This number is from the World Bank. And that sounds like an okay thing. We've had a consistent amount of land, but it's actually a misleading statistic because we've actually been losing farmland at a pretty drastic rate to land degradation. And we've destroyed over 1 million square kilometers of forest to turn that into farmland to keep that level stable. The thing is that as we till crops and as we produce foods, that land is getting further and further degraded, and we're facing significant desertification across the world. Beyond that, we've got the problem of water, where we have 70% of the fresh water in the world being used for agriculture. Oops. And yet, all around the world, due to both pumping and climate change, the aquifer levels are dropping precipitously. We essentially are running out of fresh water, as we need a lot more of it to produce our food. But land-based agriculture is only part of the problem, or part of the equation. A huge amount of our protein, I think about 10% of our protein, comes from the oceans. And hundreds of millions of people rely on the oceans for their livelihood. So this is an economic issue as well as a food issue. And yet, due to overfishing, our fisheries are in rapid decline. There was one study recently that was sort of alarming, suggested that all of our commercial fisheries could completely collapse by 2050 without significant changes in how they're managed. The next big significant challenge for food production is, of course, climate change. Everyone's very aware of this, and I believe everyone here believes, that we need to act drastically to address it. Climate change not only affects issues like, forming droughts and changing weather patterns that are kind of easy to understand, but it actually has significant kind of vicious cycles and compounding effects that get kicked off. So I'll use droughts as an example. This is something we're very familiar with in California, where I'm based. You start with a drought. You don't have enough rain or surface water to grow your crops. So easy solution, you start pumping groundwater. That's good. You're able to grow your crops for the season. But you're in a drought, so at the end of the year, it doesn't rain. You pump more groundwater. So you have a year-over-year compounding deficit. That's a problem because once it actually does rain, you've got this bigger deficit to fill. Except it's even worse than that. Because as you've pumped all that groundwater, you actually cause the land subsides. It shrinks, basically. It dries up, kind of like a prune or a dried fruit. And that means that once it does rain, the actual holding capacity of the land has decreased. And so even if you do completely recharge your aquifer, that max level is lower than it was when you started. And the next time you have a drought, the same thing happens. The problem is so bad in California that scientists now actually believe it's started to cause earthquakes. We had a 5.0 earthquake in Napa County, big winemaking district, a couple years ago, that they now believe may have been triggered by land subsidence due to that it was exacerbated by drought and groundwater pumping. So this is just kind of one particular example, but it's important to understand when we're thinking about these issues of climate change and how it's interconnected with food production, it's never quite as simple or straightforward as it seems. In most cases, it's actually worse than it seems. So when we talk about issues of conserving water, conserving land, and nutrients, this is really of the utmost importance to be able to move forward. Another kind of significant problem with climate change on the other end of the spectrum is extreme weather. Massive rain, flooding recently experienced here in Japan. You know, it's increasing in frequency and unpredictability. You can destroy crops, you can lose livestock, you can wash away topsoils. At the same time, as the climate warms, the sort of migration patterns of pests have changed. And latitudes that have not previously had certain pests, whether it's a sort of a corn boll in the United States or a plague of locusts, they're finding new places to live. Now, this is not just agricultural pests, although that's most relevant to this topic, but also human pests, mosquitoes that carry malaria are moving to more northern hemispheres. So even more of these kind of changes we have to worry about. Beyond that, climate change is obviously being caused by huge amounts of CO2 being put in the atmosphere. That now goes, huge amounts of that dissolve into the ocean, which is causing ocean acidification. That basically means that the pH of the ocean is dropping. That is interfering with some of our key species, commercially interesting food species like oysters and clams and mussels. And those levels of productivity are dropping. So that also has a significant impact on many livelihoods. What's interesting is that, as we're seeing this issue of climate change impacting so many aspects of our ability to produce food, it's actually our own agricultural system that's one of the major contributors to climate change. In fact, livestock production has been estimated to be producing 7% of all the greenhouse gas emissions on this planet. And as I mentioned earlier, we are kind of struggling to keep up our arable farmland, so there's a lot of deforestation that's going for crop production and grazing. We're destroying these very valuable carbon sinks as well, which would have helped mitigate climate change. The last big challenge that I'm going to mention here that food production is facing is the issue of labor. So around the world, there are significant trends of people moving into urban areas. Like I mentioned, there are lots of trends of rising per capita incomes. Those are generally just fine things, but traditional food production requires a lot of manual labor. And so obviously not the same everywhere in the world, but as labor costs rise, that very quickly impacts the profitability of farming. In California, this is a huge problem right now. Some of it has to do with immigration policy, and some of it just has to do with the cost of living and the rising minimum wages. There are fewer and fewer available farm workers, even as we're trying to grow more and more crops. So that's a lot of things that are problems. Hopefully it's not too depressing, but there's a lot that we have to work on. So fortunately, we have a lot of great technology and a lot of very smart people, a lot of very innovative policymakers, all working around the world to improve this. I'm going to run through some of these solutions now, and then hopefully we'll get to a nice Q&A session, because I think it's more fun when we're more interactive. Before I get too far in, I do want to actually spend a little more time on some of the issues with food production, because there's one particular sector that we really have to think about the hardest, and that's animal agriculture. So producing our livestock that we eat is the most resource-intensive form of agriculture. I think I mentioned that earlier, and it's worth reiterating. In terms of land, we're using 26% of all the ice-free land on Earth for grazing animals. we're using 33% of our croplands just to grow feed for animals. That's corn and wheat and soy. Could be feeding people, but we're condensing that through animals. We're also using trillions of gallons of water. And the problem is that it's not just an issue of turning corn into beef, but there's a feed conversion ratio. So it takes several times the weight of an animal in feed to actually produce that animal at the end. And then once you've produced it, you obviously don't eat the whole animal. You've got the skin and the bones and some of the fat that may have productive uses, but you're not eating it. So you're essentially losing a huge amount of food in the process of making meat. But people love meat. It's good. Food cultures around the world are based on meat. Obviously not every food culture. And it'd be better if more food cultures could consume less meat. But people like it. It's high in nutrient density. And in fact, in 2018, it's estimated that the global population is going to eat 242 billion kilograms of meat. That is a lot of meat. I don't even know how to envision that pile of meat or how many animals that is. If you think about that, then in terms of feed conversion ratio, you're looking at, let's average that out across a couple species of animals, at least 500 billion kilograms of animal feed. It's enormous. Hundreds of millions of acres of farmland producing that food. And it's not just people. Around the world, and especially in the United States, we have pets that eat a lot of meat as well. Just in the US, we're actually feeding our pets 15 billion kilograms of meat every year. And in fact, around the world, the global pet food industry has grown 5% year over year from 2010 to 2017. There's nothing wrong with pets, but they are eating a lot of meat, and this is a significant part of the problem. So the point of going in, taking that little aside there, is that when we're thinking about how are we going to have a sustainable food production system, we really have to emphasize animal agriculture as a top priority. So, that aside, it's possible to fix this. There are a lot of solutions that we have available for increasing the efficiency of production. That's the kind of baseline efficiencies. Developing alternatives for the current crops and products and animals that we're consuming. And then also there are a ton of opportunities for reducing waste in the production system, in transportation, and logistics. So the first kind of area I want to talk about is optimizing crop production. So now we get back into the fun stuff, which is how is technology, and particularly digitization of these industries, going to make things better? There are a few big buckets I'm going to go over in optimizing crop production. The first is precision agriculture, then indoor agriculture, and the last topic I'll touch is crop genetics. So precision agriculture is basically big data and robotics meets farming. This image is an aerial image of a field that was taken with, I think it was a combination of data from satellite imagery and either an aircraft or a drone. I believe this image is actually looking at soil moisture levels, or it might be reflected infrared in the plants. That's an indication of health. What's really cool is we can now integrate data from sensors in the field, aerial imaging, and other kinds of scanners to understand exactly what's going on in our fields at all time. So traditionally you have a field of whatever you're growing, you water the whole thing when you think it's time, you spray pesticides or fertilizers, but you don't really know if every plant in there needs that at all times. And so it's very wasteful. We end up using a lot more water than we need to. We end up over-treating, and we essentially have significantly suboptimal yields. By taking tons of data throughout the process, keeping a very high granular look at what's going on in the field at all times, you can make very targeted application decisions around irrigation, nutrient, and pesticide use. And then with robotics, we actually have now these smart tractors and drones that can go out and do the application. So this also helps deal with the labor problems. You don't actually need to have a person, walking around and sticking their finger in the dirt and, okay, it's a little dry here, let's spray a little water. So it's kind of reducing the unit of work in crop production and significantly increasing yield potentials with the same amount of resources. So this is a very exciting area. The next kind of bucket there are plant factories or indoor agriculture. This is a cool topic to bring up in Japan because Japan is really one of the pioneering nations for indoor agriculture. This is, I believe, it might be a Panasonic. I'd have to check. But this is a plant factory that is here in Japan that's producing tens of thousands of heads of lettuce every day, completely isolated from the environment. There's absolutely no dependence on the outside weather. There's no pesticide application. There's very minimal water use, very efficient land use. As you can see, there are a dozen or more layers of plant per square foot. It produces an organic product. The trade-off is, of course, that you're using more energy. You've got kind of a higher capital cost of producing this than out in a field where you basically just have dirt and the sun, which is pretty much free. But this is a great option for producing in cities. You can do it basically anywhere. It can be largely automated. It takes relatively few laborers. The other downside is that, at least currently, we're not really able to efficiently produce staple crops. So you're not going to get corn or wheat or rice produced indoors, but you do get high-value leafy greens, vegetables, and herbs. There's obviously a ton of research. These big plant factories are really just starting to hit the market. They're being built around the world, but we're in sort of generation 1.1 of this technology. So this is a really exciting area to watch. And this actually is tightly integrated with the precision agriculture because there are sensors throughout this. They're monitoring these plants. Those LED lights that you see are actually tuned the wavelength of light that is exactly what the plant needs at that point in their life, and so they're able to grow crops much faster and more efficiently. And then that last bucket that I wanted to get to on this topic was crop genetics. So many of you may be aware of new gene editing technology called CRISPR. It's CRISPR, often CRISPR-Cas9 is the current version of it. It's a new way of using the kind of natural mechanism in a cell to very quickly and efficiently target genetic changes in the natural genome of that organism. So unlike traditional transgenics where you take, like a jellyfish gene and you put it into a corn, you're really just turning on and off genes that already exist in a plant. It can be done quickly and cheaply. It does not require expensive equipment. You can actually do it on your desk at home if you have the right chemicals and enzymes available. What's so exciting about this is combine that with advances in AI, machine learning, and big data, we're able to very quickly analyze the genomes of these organisms, compare similar organisms, and find traits that are interesting, for instance, for drought resistance or resistance to a particular pest. And so there's this kind of future that we can envision very soon, which is this sort of on-demand designer crops being developed in response to changes on the ground. Let's say this year we have an invasion of a certain parasite in the field. We find a gene that resists that, or if there's a rust that is on the plants, we can just turn on the gene or turn off the gene that provides the immunity to that, produce those seeds, and by the end of the season have a new crop out there. There is a lot of research happening on this very quickly all around the world. There is not yet a lot of commercial application in agriculture, but I would say this is one of the most exciting and interesting areas on the map, and so certainly something to think about, and particularly when you're making policy decisions, important to have a framework for how you will, screen and regulate and work with these new technologies. There's a lot of risk with something new like this, but there's a huge amount of potential. So beyond basic improvement of the production efficiency of crops, the other big side of things I would talk about is reducing the impact of animal agriculture. There's kind of two ways that I think we can think about that. One is alternative proteins. So that is, let's eat something besides meat. As we know, it's got a big footprint. And the other thing is, how can we produce that meat that we are eating more efficiently? So There are a bunch of cool alternative proteins. I'll start with plant-based. Everything on the screen here is made out of plants. The burger on the top is the Impossible Burger being produced in California. It's actually made of wheat gluten and a synthetic heme, which is the molecule in beef that makes it, bleed red when it's cooked medium rare. So this plant-based burger actually bleeds. Some of you may have seen this in the news, or if you're lucky, you've tried it. It's delicious. Just to the side there, what looks like a nice piece of tuna sushi is actually a tomato. Another company in the States has developed, they are developing a line of plant-based sushi alternatives. We've got the Beyond Burger. That's another company making a burger. They use beet juice for that kind of red blood effect. But these are almost indistinguishable from the originals. Beyond Meat also makes a chicken strip, which is quite good. And then the scrambled eggs are from a company called Just, formerly known as Hampton Creek Foods. And they started out making an egg-free mayonnaise. They've now made an egg-free egg. So all of these are completely based on largely pea proteins, wheat gluten, in the one case, just a tomato. So there's exciting stuff here. It's generally good proteins. And what's cool is these are on the market. Maybe not globally, but certainly in California. The next big kind of trend in alternative meat I'll bring up is the lab-grown meat, or what's now being called clean meat, thanks to a good marketing effort. But basically, this is cellular agriculture. Researchers are taking stem cells, and they're feeding them, and they're literally growing meat cells in vats. Process actually kind of looks like brewing beer at a commercial scale. And this is a pretty early stage endeavor. No one's actually growing nice tissue like that. This is a fake image. It's kind of more like a ground meat that they can produce, because it's really just free-floating cells. But there's a huge amount of research, and actually an organization that's based in California called the Good Food Institute is supporting a lot of research on how to develop structured tissues like this. And the biggest issue they're facing is, how do you feed that meat? Because right now the kind of enzymes and the nutrients that the stem cells need to grow only exist in sort of a lab form that you'd use in a medical context. Because there's been work for a while of growing tissues for skin transplants, et cetera. So it's very, very expensive. The first lab-grown burger, I think they estimated cost $100,000. So not quite ready for prime time. But actually, our research and development headquarters at Tiny Farms is located in a building, and we were just down the hall from a company called Memphis Meats that also does lab-grown meat. They believe they've got the price of production down to $1,000 a pound, which is still very expensive, but it's 100 times cheaper than it was a couple years ago. And so it's a pretty good trajectory. And this is a very interesting thing to watch. And it's not just beef. People can do anything. There's companies doing fish, they're doing chicken, they're doing duck. The company Just that makes the eggs, in fact, is actually doing a foie gras, because we should all have more foie gras without having to force feed ducks and chickens. So really interesting alternative as well. And then my personal favorite, there's insect protein. So insects are incredibly efficient, many food producing compared to traditional livestock. They require very little space. They are, of course, very small. If you have the right species, you can grow a lot of them together. They're perfectly happy. Unlike lab-grown meat, they've actually evolved their whole kind of production system and do most of the work for you. You don't have to supply all the mechanisms of growth. And the thing is, food cultures around the world already use insects, so we kind of know which ones we can eat and what they're good for. There's been a huge amount of research done by the United Nations on the nutritional qualities, the use cases, digestibility, how to produce these things, what are traditional food uses. In the United States and in Europe, there are a whole bunch of companies making sort of Western food products using insect protein, snack chips, breads, different kinds of pastas, even a pasta sauce with a curdled meat, it's sort of a bolognese sauce, but it actually uses cricket and mealworm protein. That's really cool, but not everyone is obviously going to eat insects. So there are other opportunities like pet food. This is an area where we're focused on at Tiny Farms, where we're able to offset as much as we can of those billions of pounds of meat the pets are eating with insect protein. But the potential here is really huge in a broader sector, which is animal feed. So a huge amount of the protein that's being produced, whether it's soybeans or actually fish meal, this goes back to the fisheries, is going into animal feed. So I'll take a moment on fish meal because we're essentially scooping up huge amounts of the little bait fish in the ocean, sardines and the anchovies and the anchovetas, and then we're just grinding them up, and a lot of that is being fed right back to farmed fish. And you're, of course, losing a conversion ratio there. So you might take 2 pounds of wild fish and get 1 pound of farmed fish. This is one of these kind of crazy things where you come in from the outside and you look at the food system and says, hey, why are we doing that? That doesn't quite make sense. When we look at using something like insect protein, we actually have the same basic nutritional profile. You've got the complete amino acid profile. You've got these same good fats. The fat content of crickets, for instance, is very similar to olive oil, very healthy. But you don't have to get them out of the wild, and you don't have to depend on your traditional production systems, because insects have kind of evolved to fit into every niche in the ecosystem. That means that we can look at our food production system as it already exists and find out where there's waste, and then find an insect basically that can eat that waste. So with cricket production, for instance, we're very interested in using byproducts from bread making. So at least in the United States, commercial bakeries produce about twice as much bread as they sell, and the rest of it they just throw away or compost. Some of it gets used for feed for dairy cows, but a lot of it just goes in the trash. We can take that, we can convert it right back into this very high quality protein. So we essentially are double dipping on the nutrients that we're already producing. And this is where there's a particularly exciting opportunity. Other things that you can feed insects include cassava leaves, almond hulls, spent brewers or distillers' grains. Pretty much any organic byproduct from food and agriculture production, you can find an insect that can eat that and convert that back into a high quality protein that you don't necessarily have to eat yourself, but you can introduce back into animal feed and drastically reduce the footprint so people can keep producing meat that we want to eat without having to drastically increase the amount of resources that are going into that production system. Now, it's a nice idea that we'll just take that waste and feed it to bugs, but of course you need to have big bug farms. So I'll just go back to the insect protein slide here. The work that we're doing at Tiny Farms has been really focused around how do you produce commercial scales of insects? How do you, get to the ability to get those millions or even billions of pounds of protein? And that basically requires good design and solutions that already exist. So the nice thing about the moment that we live in is that we have spent a huge amount of time and energy and smart people figuring out how to optimize, traditional livestock production, traditional crop production, and indoor agriculture. All the pieces to the puzzle to build a very high efficiency insect farm already exist. So we're able to take, kind of the existing technology and pull it together and synthesize it for this new practice of insect production. You tie into that a lot of big data. You want to optimize your environments. You're trying to develop a new practice, which means you need to very quickly figure out what's working, what's not. You use an iterative approach. You're analyzing what's happening every generation. Nice thing about insects is they have a very short life cycle, and so it's a very quick cycle time on being able to iterate and improve your practices. So we're very quickly optimizing mass scale insect production. So that's basically all I've got for you guys. I really want to turn this into more of a discussion from here. But the main takeaways are that we face significant challenges. We're going to figure out ways to produce more with less. And I really want to emphasize the importance of focusing on animal agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brentano. Now we'd like to open up for questions and answers. Please state your name and affiliation before making comments. Your questions can be asked either in English or in Japanese. Please raise your hand if you have any questions and let us know. We will bring a microphone to you. Please.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. John Chanaki of 5+2 Corporation. I'm an independent consultant. When you produce a commercial size bug farm, what are your biggest barriers for success? Because everybody has a great idea, but when you try to mass produce it, especially from a Japanese experience, converting the raw material into whatever final product, the conversion process often takes a lot of energy, and there's no efficient catalyst or chemical process, et cetera, and that tends to become the barrier. So what are you facing in your... It's a very interesting story.
Yeah.
But in terms of massive scale production, commercialization, what is the biggest barrier do you face?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we're really breaking new ground on this. There are only a handful of companies like us that are really working on this, and so we're facing new challenges kind of as we go. Some of it is really kind of straightforward engineering challenges. How do you build a facility that will contain and manage all these animals? But like I mentioned, we're actually able to use a lot of the innovation that's been developed in plant-based indoor agriculture around environmental controls, particularly to maintain things. One of the things that we think is key to scaling this up is not to necessarily scale up every individual production facility to a huge size, but actually to build smaller kind of distributed production. So instead of one massive, 100,000 square foot or million square foot farm, you'd have, 10 smaller farms. Each one becomes much more manageable, and you reduce the kind of engineering and technological risk around management. Obviously, there's also a lot of biological risk around having a huge number of any given organism in one place that also needs to be carefully mitigated. So you need to have very careful biocontrol. It sounds like you're also kind of interested in the processing side of things. I'm not sure if that's, if I quite interpreted that correctly, but when you have a lot of basically raw insect and you have to turn that into a commodity product, that is in fact a challenge. Fortunately, we've actually been working closely with the United States Department of Agriculture on a particularly energy efficient method for drying the crickets that we produce. But there are also a number of really well pioneered drying technologies out there that work quite well for insect production, or for processing, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor?
Hi, I'm Andy Lian from Linfinity. We are doing blockchain-related supply chain. I have a question. When we talk about future food, is a very good thing. The next question that I have in mind would be the matter of security and trust. Do you think that blockchain technology can help solve some of these issues?
Yeah, that's a great question and very topical. I do think so. I think that there's one of the fundamental issues in our current food production system is that it's very difficult to track the provenance of things moving through it, whether those are commodity grains, whether that's seafood. Recent statistic in the United States, some researchers went out, I believe they're in Seattle, but I may have got that wrong. They went out and tested genetically the fish that they were being served at sushi restaurants around Seattle and found that a significant percentage of the fish that were being served was not actually the fish it was labeled as. that's kind of worrisome. You know, you think you're getting tuna, but you're actually getting something that you don't even know what it is. So I think that blockchain has a huge potential to be applied there. I think that there needs to be a lot of careful thought around how to get the entire, all the stakeholders up and down the value chain to adopt that. But interestingly, well, I know in China there's some very interesting work on this being done already, but also Walmart, our huge retail chain in the United States, is also investing and very interested in blockchain for supply chain traceability. And so that's something to look into as well. But I think it's kind of a perfect application for distributed ledger to, where the fundamental problem that you solve with that is kind of chain of control trust. And so that is a fundamental issue for food production. And in my talk, I highlighted a lot of the kind of efficiency and production issues that we're facing, but that's really only one piece of the puzzle. There's huge issues around logistics, around distribution, storage, supply chain that need to be solved as well. So it's not just producing more food, but getting that food where it needs to go, knowing that that food, particularly perishables, when you think about fish or meat, tracking that it was actually kept in its cold chain the whole way, that it's actually safe when you get it. So there's a huge opportunity for blockchain if it can be implemented, in a way that's not too cumbersome to the stakeholders. Thank you.